What would your younger self say about how your family turned out?
I remember the exact moment I realized that for my parents, my birthday had stopped existing years ago, not because they were busy or forgetful, but because they had made a conscious choice to ignore me. And the truth hit harder than anything I could have expected, leaving me with a mix of anger, disbelief, and a sharp, hollow ache that I could not just shake off with a simple apology or a shrug. For 5 years straight, I had watched my friends celebrate their birthdays, get calls, texts, little gifts, and even surprises from their parents, while my own family acted as if the date did not exist, as if the fact that I had been born was something that could be erased from the calendar entirely. And at first, I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that maybe they had forgotten, maybe it was a busy week, maybe something had come up. But year after year, month after month, it became impossible to ignore, and deep down, I knew it was intentional, that every time I brought it up or even hinted at wanting a little acknowledgement, I was met with vague excuses, dismissive shrugs, and the subtle but unmistakable implication that I was overreacting or asking too much, which, of course, made me question myself constantly until I began to dread the day altogether, forcing myself to treat it like any other day and convincing myself that I was over it, even though the emptiness lingered. I had learned to keep my distance emotionally, to hide my disappointment, and to pretend I was fine when everyone else seemed to enjoy the little celebrations. But this particular year was different, or at least I thought it might be. Because I had secretly hoped that maybe, just maybe, they would finally notice, that they would remember without me having to ask, and I had even allowed myself to think that they might be proud of the woman I had become, but that hope evaporated the instant I opened my phone and scrolled through my social media feed, where a story from my sister appeared front and center, and there it was, her face lighting up as she unwrapped a designer bag, the words "Love you, Mom and Dad" flashing across the screen in big, bold letters. A public display of affection and attention that made my stomach twist, because I knew in that moment that the same people who had spent months planning this surprise for her had not so much as considered sending me a single message. A single word, a single acknowledgement that I even existed on my birthday, and the betrayal hit harder than any argument, any fight, or any harsh word could have, because it was not even hidden, it was deliberate, it was right there for me to see. A clear indication of who they valued, who they wanted to celebrate, and who they had quietly decided did not deserve recognition, and I could feel my heart pound, my chest tighten, and a strange, cold clarity wash over me, as if the years of neglect and favoritism had finally culminated in this moment where the truth was undeniable and unavoidable. I closed my phone slowly, feeling the weight of it pressing down on me, and I realized that staying there, pretending that everything was normal, that I could keep pretending that I was okay with being invisible, would only hurt me more. And so I made a decision that would shock even me, one that felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating, because I knew walking away, even temporarily, from the family that had ignored me for so long would feel like abandonment to some, like overreaction to others, but for me, it was a reclaiming of my own worth, a statement that I was no longer willing to accept being treated like an afterthought, and I let go of the need for their approval in that moment, refusing to answer calls, ignoring texts, and simply turning my attention to my own life, my own happiness, and my own sense of value, which had been neglected for far too long. As I settled into the quiet of my apartment that evening, with no one calling, no one checking in, and no one acknowledging my existence, I felt a strange mixture of sadness, relief, and determination, knowing that I could not change the past, could not force them to see me, but I could control what happened next, how I would respond, and how I would ensure that I was never again the invisible one in a family that chose favorites over fairness. And as I lay there scrolling through messages from friends who remembered, who cared, and who celebrated me without hesitation, I felt the first flicker of an idea, a plan even, of how to make them understand what it felt like to be ignored, to be overlooked, to be dismissed entirely. And that flicker was the beginning of something that I knew would change everything, not because I wanted revenge out of spite, but because I had finally reached the point where I refused to be treated as less than, and that refusal would set in motion a chain of events that none of us could have anticipated. By the time I fell asleep that night, I had made a decision that would define the next chapter of my life, one that would not involve begging for acknowledgement, one that would not involve hoping for validation from people who had chosen to ignore me for half a decade, but one that would involve taking control, reclaiming my power, and showing, in the most undeniable way possible, that I could walk away and still thrive, while they were left scrambling to understand why I had finally disappeared from their carefully curated world. And as the first light of morning crept into my apartment, I knew with absolute certainty that this was the point of no return, that I had finally stepped off the path of silent endurance, and that whatever came next would be mine to shape, on my terms, without anyone else deciding my worth. And that realization, bitter as it was, filled me with a sense of quiet strength that I had never felt before, the kind that comes from finally refusing to accept being invisible. And I knew that from this moment on, nothing would ever be the same. After I walked away that first night, I spent the next few days in a fog of disbelief and hurt, not because I thought my parents would suddenly change or suddenly realize what they had done, but because the truth of their choices had finally settled in with a weight I could no longer ignore, and every message, every notification, every little sound that hinted at the outside world only reminded me that I had cut the tie that had bound me to their selective attention, a tie that for years had been fraying without my noticing until it snapped completely, leaving me with a sense of relief so intertwined with grief that it was hard to distinguish one from the other. And I realized that the quiet they had forced upon me for years had become a kind of space where I could finally think clearly, where I could finally consider not just how I had been treated, but what I wanted moving forward. And that realization was terrifying because for the first time in my life, I was completely alone in my decisions, and yet, in that solitude, there was also a strange clarity, a sharpness that made the path ahead feel both possible and inevitable. As I moved through my apartment, going about my routine with careful normalcy, I began to notice the patterns that had been hiding in plain sight for years, the way birthdays were celebrated only when convenient, the way achievements were recognized only when they could be paraded, the way my own accomplishments had been minimized or dismissed entirely. And I thought about my sister, not with envy but with a kind of cold understanding, because it was clear that she had been carefully curated as the family favorite, the one who received attention, validation, and public celebration while I had been relegated to the background, and that realization cut deeper than anything I had anticipated, because it was not just neglect. It was intentional neglect, and intentional neglect carried a weight and a clarity that casual oversight never could. And as I sat down with a notebook and began jotting down memories, incidents, and patterns, I felt a sense of strategy forming, a sense that if I was going to reclaim my dignity and make them understand, I had to do it on my own terms, deliberately, without letting anger cloud the precision of my actions. And that sense of control, for the first time in years, made me feel alive in a way that had nothing to do with their approval. I began small, subtle experiments to see how much they really noticed my absence, how much their indifference was dependent on convenience, and I found that even minor withdrawals from attention caused ripples of discomfort that they could not completely ignore. Small flinches in their usual behavior that confirmed everything I had suspected. They were not acting out of care, they were acting out of habit, convenience, or appearances, and that understanding, painful as it was, became the foundation of what I realized would be a carefully planned reclamation of my agency, a quiet yet undeniable assertion that their favoritism could no longer define my existence or my emotional equilibrium. And that knowledge gave me a sort of satisfaction that felt like the first bite of a meal long denied, a satisfaction born not from malice, but from clarity and control. I began to document every instance of neglect, every instance of favoritism, every tiny moment that had been pushed aside as inconsequential, and in doing so, I discovered a kind of narrative for myself, a story that was fully my own. Independent of their approval, and as I wrote, I imagined moments of subtle revelation where they would finally be confronted not with anger or dramatics, but with undeniable proof of the consequences of their choices, proof that was calculated, precise, and impossible to dismiss, and the process itself became intoxicating. The idea that I could finally take the years of silence and invisibility and convert them into something powerful and deliberate. Something that forced acknowledgement without me having to plead, beg, or cry for it, and in that realization, I found a strength I had not known existed. The days blurred together as I refined my thinking, building layers of small actions that would lead to a larger effect, like placing the first pieces of a puzzle and knowing exactly what the completed image would reveal, and even when they sent messages, tentative and guilty, trying to fill the void with superficial concern or empty apologies, I kept my distance, refusing to let them see that I was watching, that I was aware, and that I understood the full scope of their negligence, because the power now rested with me, and the thrill of holding that power, of knowing that the years of being invisible had finally yielded a position of control, was unlike anything I had expected, and it became a quiet obsession, a constant presence in my thoughts, shaping my actions, guiding every decision with precision and foresight, and as I went to bed each night, I felt the tension building, the anticipation of the eventual confrontation, the anticipation of turning years of deliberate neglect into a moment of undeniable clarity for them, and in that anticipation, I felt both the patience and the satisfaction of knowing that the game had only just begun, that every subtle move I made was building toward an inevitable reckoning, and that when it came, it would not be loud or chaotic, but measured, precise, and undeniably mine. By the end of that week, I was no longer merely the person who had been ignored for half a decade. I was the person who had reclaimed her autonomy, who had found the quiet power in absence, and who was ready to move forward with a plan that would ensure that my parents, for all their attempts at favoritism and control, would finally be forced to see, acknowledge, and understand that the years they spent pretending I did not exist had not gone unnoticed, had not been forgotten, and had not been powerless, and that realization, heavy with promise and tension, became the center of my thoughts, the engine driving me toward the next stage of my plan, and the seed of a confrontation that was coming, inevitable and undeniable. And I felt the first spark of a quiet, controlled exhilaration that only comes when you are finally prepared to turn pain into power and invisibility into undeniable presence. By the time the third week passed after I had finally walked away, I realized that the absence I had imposed on my parents was already beginning to ripple through the carefully constructed bubble of their lives, and it was a strange, almost imperceptible shift at first, subtle enough that an outsider might not notice, but glaringly obvious to me, because I had been trained for years to see the patterns of attention, neglect, and favoritism. And I could tell from the slight hesitation in my mother's tone when she left a voicemail, from the awkward pauses during the rare family video calls, and from the little indirect questions my sister asked me online, that my disappearance had created a space that no one else could fill. A vacuum of acknowledgement that they had assumed would never exist because they had relied on me silently enduring their neglect for years, and the realization that even a small act of withdrawal could create unease in a household that thrived on control gave me a sense of power I had never felt before, a power that was quiet, almost invisible, but absolute in its effects, because it forced them to confront the consequences of their choices without me ever having to raise my voice, shout, or plead for attention. And the thrill of that quiet influence became a steady presence in my mind, shaping my days, guiding my interactions, and allowing me to see clearly who my family truly valued and why. I began observing them with more attention than I had ever allowed myself before, noticing the ways my sister subtly manipulated situations to ensure she remained in the spotlight, the ways my parents bent over backwards to validate her achievements and present her life as flawless, and the casual disregard with which they dismissed my existence, and as I catalogued these patterns, I understood that the solution was not confrontation in the traditional sense, because confrontation would have played into their expectations. It would have been predictable and dismissible, and it would have allowed them to retreat behind their own defenses, but instead, I realized that the only way to truly assert my presence, to make them feel the weight of their choices, was through deliberate absence paired with a slow, calculated return that highlighted my independence, my accomplishments, and my emotional strength, all without directly attacking or challenging them in a way that would allow them to discredit me. And the more I planned, the clearer it became that my path forward required patience, precision, and timing, because a single misstep could either reveal my strategy too early or diminish the impact of the reckoning I envisioned. During this period, I began creating opportunities for small, controlled victories that allowed me to test their reactions, to understand how far their concern for appearances would push them, and to confirm that their favoritism was always conditional and performative, not genuine. And every time I achieved even the slightest acknowledgement, whether it was a tentative message from my mother or a nervous question from my sister about my well-being, I felt the first sparks of satisfaction. Because each of these moments proved that my absence was not unnoticed, that my value had been underestimated, and that I could leverage their own expectations to reshape the family dynamic without ever compromising my independence. And with every interaction, I felt my confidence grow, the clarity of my plan becoming sharper, and the anticipation of the ultimate confrontation more consuming, because I now had concrete evidence that they were uncomfortable with my autonomy, that their favoritism had limits, and that my patience and strategic restraint could amplify the consequences of their neglect in a way that would be undeniable. I also began to carefully document my successes, from small acts of financial independence to personal achievements and social victories, creating a subtle, yet growing record of my life moving forward without them. A record that would become impossible to ignore when the moment of reckoning arrived, and the process itself was deeply satisfying because it reinforced my control over the narrative that had been manipulated against me for years, allowing me to reclaim not only my self-respect, but also the psychological upper hand in a situation where I had once been powerless. And as the days turned into weeks, I could sense the tension growing subtly but relentlessly in the household, a tension born of their own guilt, insecurity, and uncertainty. A tension that I knew would become more acute when I decided the timing was right to reveal just how thoroughly I had turned the tables without them ever realizing it, and that knowledge gave me a sense of purpose and anticipation that made every day of waiting, observing, and planning feel like a strategic move in a game I was finally winning. By the end of this period, I understood that I had transformed from the overlooked daughter into a quiet force within the family, a force that could no longer be ignored or dismissed, and that the next phase, when I chose to confront or reveal my independence and the subtle ways I had restructured the emotional balance, would carry a weight that was impossible for them to avoid, because it would be built on years of calculated patience, meticulous observation, and deliberate absence. And as I prepared for that next phase, I felt a sense of power that was both liberating and intoxicating, knowing that the moment I had envisioned, the moment when my parents would finally understand the consequences of their selective love, was no longer a distant idea, but an approaching reality, a reality that I controlled entirely. And the anticipation of that confrontation filled me with a mix of exhilaration, satisfaction, and certainty that nothing would ever allow them to treat me as invisible again. And that realization, heavy and thrilling, became the center of my thoughts, the engine driving every decision, every interaction, and every calculated step toward the eventual revelation that would finally place me in the position of undeniable authority over the narrative of my own life. By the time I reached the 4th week of deliberate absence, I realized that what had started as a quiet retreat from years of neglect had evolved into a full-fledged strategic exercise, and each day I spent observing, planning, and subtly asserting my independence made me more aware of the degree to which my parents' favoritism had been performative, because even in their guilt, they had no real understanding of what it meant to disregard my existence for half a decade. And I began to see how Every action I took, every decision I made, even without their direct acknowledgement, was already starting to shift the balance of control in our family dynamic, giving me a sense of power that I had never anticipated. A power that came not from confrontation, anger, or blame, but from clarity, self-respect, and the quiet demonstration that my absence was meaningful, consequential, and ultimately inescapable for them, and in that realization, I began to craft the next phase of my plan with precision, knowing that subtle influence would always be more effective than overt conflict because it forced them to confront their choices without the comfort of denial or distraction, and the anticipation of the eventual reckoning became a constant, energizing presence in my mind, sharpening my focus and determination. I started carefully orchestrating situations that would expose the unevenness of their favoritism in ways they could not ignore, beginning with small, innocuous moves that subtly highlighted my independence and achievements, like attending social events, accepting opportunities for recognition, and celebrating personal milestones online in ways that my parents could not conveniently dismiss or ignore, and every time I did so, I paid close attention to their responses, or lack thereof, documenting every hint of discomfort, hesitation, or unspoken acknowledgement, because I knew that these microreactions were the key indicators of the impact my absence and my deliberate presence elsewhere were having on the family's equilibrium. And I felt a quiet thrill in realizing that the careful patience I had cultivated over weeks was finally producing tangible effects, that the household was subtly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to shift under the weight of its own selective attention. And that understanding fueled both my confidence and my resolve to maintain the careful balance I had created until the moment of full revelation arrived. I also began testing my sister's reactions in controlled ways, observing how she sought validation from our parents, how she managed her own achievements, and how quickly she noticed any deviation from the usual hierarchy that had been established to her benefit, and with each observation, I discovered small vulnerabilities, small cracks in the armor of her curated life that had been supported entirely by parental favoritism, and I began to imagine a way to expose those cracks subtly, not to harm her, but to reveal that the unearned advantages she had relied on for years could be disrupted without me ever raising my voice, and in doing so, I realized that my plan required not only patience and precision, but also an unwavering commitment to self-control, because any overt display of anger or resentment would undermine the careful tension I had cultivated. And the satisfaction I derived from knowing that I could influence the family dynamic simply through absence and calculated engagement became a driving force in my daily life, a quiet yet exhilarating affirmation that I was no longer powerless. As I navigated these weeks, I also cultivated my own emotional resilience, recognizing that my parents' attempts to reassert control through indirect messages, casual inquiries, or passive-aggressive statements could no longer provoke me in the ways they once had, and I responded instead with controlled awareness, choosing when and how to engage with them in ways that maximized their awareness of my autonomy without providing them an immediate outlet to dismiss or manipulate me, and that conscious control over my reactions, combined with the carefully orchestrated positioning of my presence and achievements, made each small interaction a test of their own recognition of the consequences of years of neglect. And every hesitant acknowledgement or forced compliment became a subtle yet undeniable proof of the effectiveness of my strategy, proof that the power had shifted quietly but irrevocably into my hands. By the end of the month, I had not only established my own space of independence, but also created a scenario in which my parents could no longer ignore me without confronting the consequences of their past neglect. And the awareness of this inevitable confrontation, the knowledge that I had turned 5 years of deliberate invisibility into a position of undeniable control, filled me with a sense of satisfaction and anticipation that was almost overwhelming, because I now understood that when the time came to reveal the full extent of my presence, autonomy, and subtle influence, it would be a moment of clarity for them that they could neither deny nor deflect, and in that understanding, I found both closure for the years of hurt and the excitement of the inevitable revelation, knowing that the stage was set for a reckoning that would be entirely of my own making, precise, deliberate, and brilliantly unavoidable. The moment I had been waiting for, meticulously calculated, anticipated, and patiently orchestrated for weeks, finally arrived with a quiet inevitability that felt both exhilarating and terrifying, because after years of feeling invisible, dismissed, and intentionally overlooked, I now held the full measure of control over a situation that had always been dominated by my parents' selective attention, and the power was intoxicating, not in a boastful way, but in the clarity it gave me to see. Every manipulation, every subtle favoritism, every casual dismissal of my existence reflected back in their reactions as I began to re-enter their lives on my own terms. And when my mother appeared on my doorstep days after I had fully removed myself from their orbit, the combination of fear, desperation, and realization in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. Because she had finally understood that her attempts to erase me had failed, and that the child she had ignored for half a decade had not only survived, but had thrived, grown strong, independent, and unshakably confident in her own value, and the years of neglect and calculated favoritism that had once kept me small and invisible were now reflected as guilt and uncertainty, tangible and undeniable, in every hesitant movement and every faltering word she offered. I could feel her trying to frame her presence as concern, as if a simple apology, a plea, or a promise could repair 5 years of deliberate exclusion, and for a moment, I let her speak, listening to every carefully chosen word. Every trembling attempt to justify, to rationalize, to manipulate me back into the role she had assigned to me, but I had already learned that true control came not from confrontation but from quiet, deliberate observation and the strategic withholding of influence. So I remained calm, collected, and utterly unyielding, allowing her to reveal the depth of her desperation, the cracks in her composure, and the unmistakable realization that the years of ignoring me had produced consequences she could no longer dismiss. And the satisfaction of watching her internal struggle was profound, because it confirmed every hypothesis I had developed during my period of absence, that she had relied on my silence, my endurance, and my compliance for far too long, and now that silence had become my instrument, my quiet assertion of autonomy, and the leverage that made her pleading simultaneously pathetic and powerless. As my mother fumbled through explanations, half-apologies, and indirect appeals to familial loyalty, I realized that the ultimate triumph was not in shaming her, berating her, or forcing her to beg, but in demonstrating the stark contrast between her selective love and the life I had built entirely independent of it, and I began to outline my own terms, deliberately, precisely, and without hesitation, making it clear that any reconciliation would require acknowledgement of my autonomy, my worth, and the deliberate choices they had made to marginalize me, and in that moment, the weight of years of being invisible shifted entirely, because I could dictate the boundaries of our interaction, the pace of any potential relationship, and the consequences of their past decisions in ways that were irrefutable, visible, and emotionally impactful, and watching the panic, realization, and fear settle across my mother's face as she grasped that their attempts to control me had not only failed but had produced the exact opposite effect was profoundly satisfying, not because I wanted to hurt her, but because justice had been delivered in the most undeniable and strategically perfect form. The life they had ignored had flourished, and they had no control over it. I also made a point to address my sister, subtly, carefully, without confrontation, letting my mother's pleas and explanations underscore the favoritism that had always been granted at my expense, and as I spoke, I could see the realization dawning on both of them that their carefully constructed hierarchy, which had relied on my compliance and invisibility, had crumbled in the quietest, most elegant way imaginable, leaving them exposed, vulnerable, and forced to reckon with the consequences of years of deliberate exclusion. And I took no pleasure in humiliation, only in the clarity of the reversal, in the undeniable proof that I had achieved the ultimate form of emotional justice, one that did not require me to stoop to their level, but instead relied entirely on patience, strategy, and the undeniable truth of my own worth. By the end of the encounter, when my mother finally left, exhausted, pleading, and clearly shaken, I understood that the reckoning was complete, not because she apologized or begged effectively, but because the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Permanently, in my favor, and for the first time in my life, I felt the full satisfaction of having reclaimed my presence, my voice, and my emotional power in a household that had spent half a decade attempting to erase me, and as I closed the door, I felt a profound mixture of relief, triumph, and quiet exhilaration, knowing that I had turned absence into influence, neglect into clarity, and 5 years of deliberate erasure into a final, unassailable victory that no amount of pleading, apology, or rationalization could undo, and in that moment, I smiled to myself, fully aware that I had not only survived, but had rewritten the rules of engagement, establishing once and for all that my presence was no longer negotiable, my worth no longer dependent on their selective love, and my life entirely my own to control, and the brilliance of that realization, hard-won, deliberate, and utterly satisfying, was the final statement in a story that had begun with erasure and ended with undeniable triumph.